Thank you very much. James Purnell, you were trying to convey the impression that the BBC was a beacon of impartiality and all the rest of it. What's the role of Richard Sambrook in this organisation, which already has the highest standards of impartiality?
Well, as you know, he was a senior figure in news, but he left some time ago and is now at the Cardiff University of Journalism. I think you're referring to a review that he's doing of social media, but I'm sure you're going to go on to talk about some tweets that he put out to us he was not working for the BBC.
Yes, so he's sort of your sort of advisor on impartiality and all this kind of stuff and all the rest of it. And yet, when you go through his tweets, I'm strongly Remain 2 years after the referendum. Donald Trump and Boris Johnson are post-truth politicians. More Boris lies, now a man of zero integrity. Britain is being led to an epic act of national self-harm over Brexit. Brexit is not the will of the British people. Is this really the man that the BBC wants to turn to try and deal with the issue that many people in sort of, particularly in many northern areas, think that the BBC has a metropolitan, London-centric, pro-Remain view of the world? Is he really the answer to that particular problem?
Well, he's not advising us on impartiality. As far as I know, he's doing a review into social media. And actually, the very point which, in some ways, you're alluding to, which is clearly people who work at the BBC have got a whole range of views. You know, people come in, you want people to come into the organisation who are engaged and have views. When you come into the organisation and you work here, you leave those views at the door. And we have a very, very strong culture, very strong working practices to make sure that we leave those views at the door. And when we are working for the BBC, we do so very much within the editorial guidelines. People then leave to go and work in all sorts of ways, and then you do find out what their views are. I mean, clearly, there's a range of members on this committee who work for the BBC. You know, we've had campaigns led by the Conservatives, the Conservative campaign led by someone who worked for the BBC, Paul Lambert, who sadly recently deceased, worked for UKIP. People gone to work for the Labour Party and the Lib Dems. So I think you don't just want to have people at the BBC who don't have any views at all. What you want to have is a very strong culture so that we are impartial in our journalism. And that's just true of Richard as of many other people.
But that's just the problem, isn't it? The problem is the BBC doesn't have people with a range of views. They all seem to have a typically North London, metropolitan, pro-Remain view of the world. That's largely the cultural problem within the BBC, and that it therefore is a million miles away from people's views in Yorkshire and Norfolk and Lincolnshire and whatever. That is actually the problem, isn't it? Do you not accept that the BBC does have a problem with that, even if it's only a perception? Do you not accept there is a perception problem, if nothing else?
Look, I can't influence people's, I can't control people's perceptions, but what we are doing is making sure that we have a BBC that isn't metropolitan in that way. You know, when I worked here in the 1990s, we were overwhelmingly based in London. We now have more than half of our team outside of London. We make programmes across the whole of the UK. We've recently launched a Scotland channel. We have a fantastic world-beating drama department and now industry in Wales. We have local radio serving the whole country. So in this crisis, for example, you know, all of our local radio stations have been working on their Make a Difference campaign to make sure that we work with people in all of those places. We've had over 600,000 contacts, and we are helping people through local radio, our regional news, which is our most popular programme on BBC One, reaching 8 or sometimes 9 million people a week. So I just don't recognise your characterisation. Actually, one of the things that a Martian looking at the BBC would see is this is an organisation for the whole UK. It's probably the most UK-wide organisation of any that we have in this country, and we take that very, very seriously. And we have a very strong diversity of view within the BBC, as is illustrated by the members of this committee, and indeed by the list of alumni that I just mentioned, 2 of whom either ran or were involved in campaigns which were very much not what you just described.
Over the last 2 weeks, we've seen some appalling scenes in London in particular, but other cities as well. Violent disorder. Can you explain why the weekend just gone was described by the BBC as violent London protests, which led to 6 police officers being injured, and yet the previous week's activities were described as largely peaceful protests, which led to 62 police officers being injured.
Yes, I can. So the quote, I think, about being largely peaceful, that was from the police. And I think with all of these protests and demonstrations, there's an editorial challenge because, of course, the disruption, the violence is newsworthy, and we have to reflect that. But it's also true that whether here or in America, the vast majority of that people going on that demonstration did not get involved in violence. So, in the headline, you try and capture both of those things. Obviously, when you then go and listen to the program, if you watch the brilliant panorama, which Clive Murray did last night, you get more detail and context. You get to explore, the tension between those two aspects of the story. I think it's also worth saying that the demonstrations this weekend were of far fewer people, whereas the ones before had, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people demonstrating. So there's the numbers are a bit misleading there. It's really about the proportion, but we're always trying to get that right. If you only focus on the minority of violent incidents, you distort the facts. If you only focus on the peaceful demonstration, you also distort the facts. We try and tell the whole story.
So why was the discrepancy in this case? Because on that basis, virtually every protest would be largely peaceful. I mean, maybe even during World War II, relationships between the UK and Germany were largely peaceful on that basis. I mean, if that's going to be a criteria for largely peaceful, then presumably every demonstration will be described as largely peaceful. So why did you only just pick out that one?
Well, there were a far smaller number of people involved in the demonstration of the weekend, and it was our editorial judgment looking at it that was the right way of characterising it. And it's a judgment that we make in each case, and it's nothing to do with politics. It's just to do with the different nature of the events on successive weekends.
Steve Bryan mentioned about Emily Maitlis. What worries me about Emily Maitlis's oration was that it wasn't a sort of just on the wrong side of impartiality. I mean, it was absolutely blatant. It was an absolutely blatant statement of what she believed and the BBC believed. It had there was no remoteness amount of impartiality in it. What worries me is, how does that culture develop at the BBC that actually allows people to think that it's perfectly acceptable to do that in the first place? Surely, if the BBC was such a beacon of impartiality, no one would even have thought about doing something like that in the first place. Doesn't it go to show that there's a problem at the heart of the culture of the BBC that allows that to happen in the first place?
No, not at all. And obviously, we've gone through that territory with Mr. Bryan. We can go through it again if you want to. It's because we thought that those things should have been done as questions, which is the typical way that they would be done in a sort of setup to a program. We corrected it very quickly. We make thousands and thousands of hours of news. We have our journalists, brilliant journalists like Emily Maitlis, like Laura Kunsberg, making judgments like that the whole time. There's a very small number of times when we get it wrong. We correct it quickly and we put that out. We also have a regulatory system to do that. But in the end, it's not really for us to judge; it's for the public to judge. And as I say, when you go and look, for example, at this lockdown crisis, 50% of the public have trusted the BBC for their news on COVID. The next highest is 16%, which is people like the WHO and the NHS. When you ask people whether they trust BBC News, it's normally between 60 and 70%. And I just don't think that it's true that there is we don't believe in a particular set of political views as an organisation, which is what I think you were trying to say. We don't. It's our role here to reflect that debate and challenge people, whatever their point of view may be, and to do so impartially and with due accuracy.
Well, let me ask it this way then. Do you think that Emily Maitlis's soliloquy on Newsnight was just on the wrong side of impartiality, or a long way away from being impartial? Did you do what's your view? Was it absolutely blatant, as I seem to think it is, or did it just fall on the wrong side?
Look, I'm not going to give a running commentary on that particular topic, and we've gone over it quite a lot in this committee. We corrected it very quickly, and we did so because we thought that there was something that had not been right with what had been put at the top of the programme. If you think of those things as questions rather than as statements, which is how I think they were intended, I think that would be something which would be quite different. And the way to judge that programme, I think, is as a whole and looking at the journalism. As I say, Emily and the team at Newsnight have done some brilliant journalism over the course of this crisis.
Would it be helpful to BBC journalists to know, wouldn't it, if they're thinking about what they want senior people to give them a steer, so they not know whether that was, you know, just a bit wrong or very wrong. I'm sure they'd like to have a steer from senior BBC people, so for future reference.
I'm sure there's been many conversations about this item, as there are about all items of the BBC. As I was explaining to Mr. Brennan, you know, every morning BBC News has a very self-searching review of what they did the day before, what they're going to do that day. And as many of your colleagues on this committee can testify, you know, that culture is extremely candid and extremely straightforward. So I don't think there's any lack of discussion of editorial judgments in BBC News. That's something which is a very, very strong part of the culture.
And my final question, Chairman, if I may, is that Steve Anderson, who was a former executive producer of BBC Question Time, editor of 6 O'Clock News, a former editor of Newsnight and Panorama, on the Blue Collar Conversations podcast, he said that the media hasn't been well equipped to deal with coronavirus, that the public resent the media covering the story as if it's another political story. And they don't want to hear an announcement being attacked just because it's a government announcement, as seems to be the case. What would you say to those criticisms that Steve Anderson's made?
Look, we listen to all criticisms. As I say, that's a big part of our culture here. I would just say that's not what the research which Ofcom have carried out, for example, are saying. They're finding that the BBC, for example, is the most trusted organisation on this topic, but also that public service broadcasting overall has been one of the main places that people go to for information. And I don't think it's true that we attack every single announcement. That's not our job. Our job is to question and to challenge. We've been playing a very important role in terms of providing wider information. As I say, people have really turned to us in this period. 45 million people, 44 million coming to BBC News in that first week on the 23rd of March. Our audiences for the 6 and the 10 News have doubled compared to normal. We're getting 8 or 9 million people coming to our regional programme at 6:30. We've had 640,000 contacts from our local news. And when you go and ask people what they think about that news, you know, it's rated 70, 75, 80% positively by the public when we ask them across a whole wide range of class and age. So, you know, we listen to all views, but that is not the information that we're getting back from research from Ofcom and from other sources as well. And I think, in fact, I would say that what this crisis has shown is the ability of public service broadcasting to turn on a sixpence, despite the fact that only 10% of our team are in our workplaces, and offer a service which, you know, is not the kind of night watchman service that was being talked about the last time this committee met, but basically a service which has pretty much replicated everything that we had before the shutdown. And on top of that, provided a whole range of extra programmes. So Fallout on Radio 4, the Daily Call on 5 Live, the coverage of all of the nation's individual briefings from their first ministers, as well as, you know, widespread coverage of the briefings from Number 10 every day, reaching the vast majority of people in this country. And it's because, you know, in a public service organisation like ours, we combine that commitment to serving the public with a dedication to reform, that we've been able to do that so effectively. You know, if we hadn't reformed the BBC to modernise iPlayer, to launch Sounds, to have a news online service which exploits the best of modern technology, we would not have been able to reach the public in that way, and the UK would not have had the ability to get that information out to people. Equally, it's important to challenge those questions, because that's how you get to better answers. It's important to have journalism which is without fear or favour, and which goes out and works out when things aren't as they have been promised, when things aren't as they have said, when there's a different story, when there are scandals, because that's how society improves. That is a key part of the value of journalism in this country. So we've been able to do that precisely because we're a public service, precisely because we're public funded, and precisely because all that we care about is serving the public and serving everyone in this country, regardless of their background, circumstance, or where they live.